I am going to be presenting today on a drone study that I did on overnight parking occupancy in my city. A little introduction about myself. In my day job, I work as a software engineer. Previous to that, I used to run a drone photography company starting in Philly. There's also in the audience from Philly, which is awesome, called Philly by Drone. And ever since moving to the Bay Area, I've been spending a lot of my time outside of work volunteering on various commissions. Currently, I serve on East Palo Alto's Planning Commission, and I'm also on the Community Advisory Committee for our San Mateo County Transportation Authority. And previous to that, I was also chair of East Palo Alto's Public Works and Transportation Commission. And today I'm here speaking solely on my own behalf, not on behalf of any of those organizations. The main topics today will focus on drone collection of on-street parking occupancy data. I tailored the presentation mainly towards the Parking Reform Network guests, and from the Slack, I saw a lot of interest in, some of the folks from Australia had asked, how can we get this done in our city? So a big portion of the conversation will be sharing some of the technical details there on how to scale this in other places. I will talk about analysis of data and also some of the findings. I won't spend a lot of time talking about the problem since I assume that most of the Parking Forum Network members are already aware of the issues with parking in their cities, but I'll talk briefly about that later as well. I'll be focusing 20 minutes on the presentation and I'll ask the attendees to hold any questions and comments until the Q&A at the end, since we'll have a lot of content to get through, a lot of exciting content. Talk about introduction, the study methods, and then the results and limitations. So first, let me start with the higher level context on what region we're talking about of East Palo Alto. So this is a map on the left of the San Francisco Bay Area. It's about 50 miles from the north to the south here, 50 or 70 miles. And East Palo Alto is located over here in the Blue Triangle, along the peninsula of the bay. The city's pretty small, only 2 square miles of land area and over 30,000 residents. And if you divide those two numbers, you actually get a per capita population that is almost up there with San Francisco, 80 to 90% of the population density as our biggest city in the Bay Area. I'll talk more about that in a bit. Geographically, East Palo Alto over here in the Blue Star, um, is very centrally located, and that brings its pros and cons. One of the things that East Palo Alto residents notice a lot is a lot of cut-through traffic coming from everywhere on the right side of the bay here and beyond. And as the Bay Area has been expanding, both in height and also spreading out, more and more cars have been coming across these bridges every year. And the closest one to us is called the Dunbarton Bridge. So I'll be talking a little bit about that context later, but it's important to keep in mind about kind of where we're situated, and a lot of people get off the bridge and go through East Palo Alto to get to the other highways. Historically, while most of the Bay Area is pretty affluent because of the booming Silicon Valley historically and now AI, East Palo Alto is an anomaly. And a lot of it is because the city was redlined before, and only blacks could live in the city at some point. And even though that's no longer the case with redlining, it's still a majority people of color. And also, at one point in 1992, East Palo Alto was actually the murder capital of the US in terms of the highest number of murders per capita, even more than Detroit and Chicago and Compton. The crime rates have plunged a lot with change in gentrification. 2 years ago, we actually reached zero murders. And with improving safety, it's also been leading to a trend towards more people wanting to live here. And in some cases, because it's a very working class community, and because a lot of the rents have increased like 3 times in the Bay Area in the last decade or so, it's led to a lot of significant overcrowding in single family homes due to these rising housing costs. And on many streets, it's not every home, but there are definitely a number of homes where there are literally 20 or more people living in a single family house, like a 5,000 square foot lot, three bedrooms, and maybe three or four sheds in the back, and each one has like a family of four or five. That's actually a real situation in the city. And I'll talk a bit about overcrowding and its effects on parking. In terms of land use, most of East Palo Alto is single family homes built in the 1940s and 1950s, before and after World War II. I just wanted to give this context here where most of the things in blue and green here are from those time periods. And there's not a lot of higher density, but most of the higher density is closer to the west side of the 101, like this southern portion of the city. Most of the rest is single family homes for the most part. There's a business district on the northeast, and then there's also a shopping center over here near the south. And here's just another context map. East Palo Alto is surrounded by very affluent areas, like I've mentioned. You have Stanford University 4 miles away. You have Meta's, Facebook's headquarters, just 2 miles away. Google's headquarters 4 or 5 miles to the southeast. And those have definitely been changing the the demand to live in East Palo Alto and a lot of those job centers. And East Palo Alto on this map is, I don't know if you can see my mouse, Paula, if you can confirm, but it's this portion that I'm outlining over here. Let me annotate it actually. Yeah, right here. Okay. And also this side. Okay.
We can see your mouse and the drawing lines.
Okay. I don't actually know how to clear that. Okay, so why high parking occupancy? A lot of overcrowding of homes, and working class needs cars, sometimes multiple, one like pickup truck and then a personal car. And there's some evidence of residents from neighboring cities, such as Menlo Park and Palo Alto, storing their vehicles overnight in East Palo Alto due to their city's very strict parking restrictions. For example, in the neighboring Menlo Park, none of the residents can store their cars overnight on the public streets, besides some special areas. And there's also been some anecdotal stories I've heard from a number of residents seeing evidence of commuters coming from an hour or two away who cross the bridge, leaving their work cars in East Palo Alto, like a convenient car storage spot, and then they'll get back in one car and carpool back home to save money on the bridge tolls and also save time. So a lot of these factors I think have 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 led to more high parking occupancy. And this has been a known problem for at least a decade now, and it's actually still been around. And so these are some of the problems. A lot of new development and projects often get blocked due to concerns about increased traffic. And the city also doesn't have a downtown. And to get a downtown, a lot of retailers will be concerned about parking. Can people park to access? And from my drone study, I noticed that about 84% of the streets are occupied at night. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Let me see if I can clear this screen. Okay. All right. So using my drone background, I decided to use drones for data collection during the evenings in East Palo Alto. And even historically, when I ran my own drone photography company, I used normal drones with just a typical camera, and you can't see anything at nighttime. And the thing was that for our city, which is mostly residential, we wanted to be able to collect data at night because that's when most people are home and most cars are on the street. And when I talked to our city's transportation consultant and also talked to some of our neighboring cities, such as the city of Palo Alto, a different city, to collect data on 38 linear miles of street would have been about a $250,000 project. Most of that on the manual data collection where people are driving around in cars. If they're more optimized, might have one person, and then they might have a video recording and they'll have to go back. And I found that drones could be a lot more efficient because drones don't have to, they can fly in different directions. So you don't have to like go into streets and back out. You can see the streets at all times. you can see facing down, so you actually see a lot more information. Like double parked cars might be hard to see if you're just driving by on the ground. And the idea was actually encouraged by our city's own transportation consultant. I was looking at other things with drones, and they're like, "Hey, you should look into this because this is something we actually really need." And at the time when I collected the data in June 2025, our city council was actually considering its first ever residential parking permit program. And in a lot of the public discourse and meetings, council members and the public were asking for data on how full our streets were. We had data from 8 years ago from a mobility study, but the city could only, or for whatever reason, we could only record data for about 10 to 20% of our streets. I think probably largely due to cost. So I did this all on a volunteer basis in June 2025. The drone I used is this Autel thermal drone, which is unique in that it has a thermal camera so you can see at night. So for example, here's a photo I took at night. You can see it's dark outside. Typically with a normal drone, if I was recording video, would not be able to see anything. And with the thermal camera, you could see the cars that are on the street here. To address some privacy concerns, I kept the drone over public streets facing downwards, and then I maxed out the height to 400 feet to reduce noise and lights. And the reason I flew at 9 to 10 p.m. was so it would capture more of the cars after they had come home. And also because our local airport, the Palo Alto airport, the airspace restrictions relax significantly after 9 p.m. or the Class D airspace ends in technical terms. And typically in many parts of the city, you can only fly up to 100 or 200 feet. And in some parts, you can't fly at all. So that was it happened to work out for this case. And I have more technical details in this blog post here on the East Palo Alto Sun, which I run. Here's a drone video, just a sample showing an example of what the footage looks like from the drone. And I went about manually counting the number of cars on each street segment. And speaking of manually counting, I'll be segueing over to the data processing workflow now. So this is where we'll be going more technical. The following slides will show screenshots of these, so you don't have to fully understand what this is saying right now. But from a high level, if you look at the red segment here, in general, I started with a GIS map that contained street segments. I had to do some pre-processing in order to get segments in between intersections. I wanted the segments as short as possible, so I wouldn't have to remember there were like 100 cars. I could just log data faster and also get more granular details. I use Google My Maps um, in order to record the parking counts. So there's a numerator and a denominator. The numerator is the number of cars observed on each street segment at night, and then the denominator is the number of cars that can at maximum fit. So hence there were two layers or two files, one for the numerator and one for the denominator. I'll talk more about that in a bit. After that, I consolidated the different dates of data collection into one layer in the form of a CSV. And then I imported both of those files, a consolidated numerator and then the denominator, into a free software I discovered called Foursquare Studio, which I highly recommend. And after importing that, I joined the two layers together based off of the street segment ID in order to divide the two numbers and get a parking percentage occupancy. And then lastly, because some of the streets I was able to record twice or maybe even three times, but most of them were only once. For the ones that had multiple, I wanted to average the data points so that we can get less variance, and that was the group by at the end. So now we're going to look at each step in a bit more detail visually. This is a QGIS software that I was using. I've seen it mentioned in some of the Parking Reform Network talks. And here I did a split with lines. I started with the US Census data source that's mentioned here, US Census Tiger. It covers data on street segments, I think nationally in the US. And I just downloaded for San Mateo County. So I split with lines, which allowed me to originally some of the streets were like all the way down here, for example, and I wanted them more granular. So that allowed it to get smaller segments. And then after that, I also did a filter based off of East Palo Alto, since I only was looking at our city. And then I wanted to maintain the length of each street segment, and for whatever reason, I had to reproject it into a different into I don't know the technical term here, but into this 26910 so that I can get the length of the geometry, which was useful for estimating some of the parking occupants, the parking capacities of streets. Okay, now moving to the next step, these were things I learned through the Parking Reform Network, through one of the talks when I first became a member a few months ago. And by the way, previously I hadn't worked with any of these software, so Parking Reform Network definitely helped get me up to speed on some things. But here I've taken the exported files from these last steps and imported the KML files into Google My Maps, which is a free software. And then for each day, I ended up watching the drone video footage, counting the number of cars that was observed on each street segment, and then I would click on this corresponding line here and enter the value for the number of cars seen into this layer. You can ignore the colors here, but the darker ones here in this case are the ones with more cars. But it's not normalized, so longer streets will probably be darker. And there are all these layers here, and so I needed to consolidate them into one spreadsheet. And I did that here. I just exported each layer, put them into as a CSV, and made a long CSV sheet with the timestamp and the number of cars. Everything else generally came out of the US Census data. This FID is the street segment ID, just a unique identifier that was generated by QGIS. So I just talked about the numerator. Next, I'll talk about the denominator. This was a map used to compute the street parking capacity of each street segment, and anything that's shown in blue here were things that I had to manually override. Why did I manually override certain streets? Well, first of all, Hexagon, the transportation consultant, shared with me the data they had collected on some of these streets. So, like the southeast portion of the city, I was very grateful since I didn't have to go to Google Maps and measure the number of 20-foot bounding boxes. The other anomalies were typically streets that weren't normal in the sense that they were cul-de-sacs or they were streets that only had parking on one side. And in which case, I couldn't just use a math formula to try and back out the approximate capacity. So I made sure to do that on some of the more special scenarios. Even some of these long streets here are not, this is like the business zone, they're not single family. So I couldn't assume that it was like a certain amount of driveway, curb cuts, etc. But most of the gray streets here are more standard since they're just single family homes built on both sides. I could estimate them more confidently. And this was the corresponding CSV export shown in Excel here, where um, I didn't show the formula, but it's in the blog post. For every street, there's like a max cars hypothetical using a formula. But and then everything you saw in blue earlier was the max cars that were overridden. So if there's an override, I override the hypothetical value, and that becomes the new denominator. Now I'm going to move towards the Foursquare Studio aspect where I combined these two spreadsheets and then imported it into a visualization tool. So over here, this is just a high level where I imported two files, the max cars and the night street parking. I did a join and then did a group by. And I'll talk a bit more about that here next. This is a join where the main things to focus on here are just that I joined by the street segment's unique ID. And by joining those, I could then divide the number of cars seen by the max cars to get the percentage. Most other things can be ignored here. And then after that, I did that group by in order to average the occupancy values that if the same street was seen or recorded on multiple nights. And this is the resulting view in the Foursquare Studio. And this is also a public link, by the way. Which let me see if I can even just put it in the chat in case anyone's curious to follow along. Okay. So here's that link. You can interact with it. Feel free to make any changes. It won't change the underlying data set. It'll just change on your end. Overall in the city, we saw about 84% street parking occupancy at night between 9 to 10 p.m. I think that's really high because there are days of the week where there's like trash collection day where people need to put out trash cans. There's days where there's street sweeping where you can't park on one side of the road in the mornings. So we need a healthy buffer. And not to mention, yeah, I'll go into that later. And in general, there are 33.6 street miles collected. Some of the streets I had either forgotten to collect, or in this case, like University Avenue, which is this north-south street, doesn't allow parking on either side. So it was I didn't have any data points for those streets. Same with some parts of East Bayshore over here and Donahoe, where parking is just not allowed. And this is the freeway in between, so that one's excluded as well. Same with Bay Road. There's no parking on either side. And next, I'm going to talk about some findings, or first, I'll talk about some limitations. I think the main thing to call out here is that I think the true parking occupancy is likely underestimated because typically transportation consultants would collect data between 12 a.m. to 4 a.m. to really get the peak parking occupancy once everyone is home. My data was collected between 9 to 10 p.m., so I think the true number would have been higher. And then one other thing to call out is that thermal imaging can't see through trees. It can see if it's a smaller tree, I can see the car, such as in this photo on the left. But if the tree is really big, which is just a couple percentage of our streets, then the drone could not see whether there was a car underneath or not. And if I wasn't confident, I stayed conservative and didn't count any cars there. So that should also boost up the true parking occupancy in our city. Next, I'm going to talk about some of the findings. The three main findings I wanted to share, and some are pretty surprising to me. The first one is that based on the analysis, I noticed that some apartments actually had lower parking occupancy on the streets around them. And that was quite surprising to me because even for this 100% affordable five-story apartment building that had opened a couple years ago, I had heard complaints from some of the people living in this HOA just directly north of it that parking had gotten a lot worse. But when I looked at the drone footage and the data, actually it was like 20% lower street parking occupancy compared to some of the other, compared to the city average. So that's one thing. And then the converse also held true. The converse being that single family neighborhoods actually had higher parking occupancy in our city, which is typically kind of surprising since you would expect lower density. So this is a neighborhood I've geometrically filtered down to on the northern part of the city. And in this case, the average street occupancy I recorded was about 96%. And what was really surprising was that some of the streets that were the most occupied were the ones that were like kind of on the edge of the city. Everything to the north of this blue box is just empty marshland, same as to the west and to the east. And the nearest apartment is more than half a mile away at University and Bay. And so the main things I could point to were one, potential overcrowding of the homes, which would of course generate more demand for parking. And one other finding I'll talk about next, or hypothesis as well. And I do see the questions rolling in. I'll be happy to answer them later. Feel free to type it there. So here's one last thing that I had noticed. I noticed that there was higher parking occupancy near our main north-south corridor, which is this University Avenue. This visualization I have here reflects what our zoning would allow by right if everything were built out. Right now, many of these buildings in white that are between 5 to 8 stories don't exist yet, but I just kind of wanted to show that context of where the city is moving towards based on its 2035 vision. And if you look at this map, something that I found pretty interesting is that if you hold the single family home neighborhoods constant, for example, this whole portion right here is pretty much all single family homes. This northern portion is all single family homes. And this southeast portion is also all single family homes. If we assume that overcrowding was an issue in all of these neighborhoods, we would expect that they should be roughly the same parking occupancy. But that's actually not the case. When I looked at Kavanaugh neighborhood, which is this portion over here, just kind of on the northwest of the city, saw 111%. And by the way, numbers could be over 100%. And that's also what our transportation consultants found 8 years ago as well. Because on some streets, the parking is so bad that people have started parking illegally, either like perpendicular at the end of cul-de-sacs or even double parking where they shouldn't be because they can't find enough. And so if you look at this map where dark red are the streets with higher occupancy, typically over 100%, and light yellow are the ones with lower parking occupancy, you notice that as you look closer towards the middle of the graph, towards our main north-south corridor, it gets more red towards the middle and becomes more yellow towards the outside. And by the way, most of these apartments don't even exist yet over here in the middle of the city. So I wouldn't factor it all towards apartments, especially given the other finding that in some cases apartments have lower parking occupancy. My hypothesis on this is I think that there may be some work truck vehicle storage from commuters, like outsiders who don't live in East Palo Alto, where it would be more strategic to leave your work vehicle closer to the main cut-through corridor so that it would look something like this. If you were driving from 2 hours away in the morning and needed to drive towards the peninsula for work, three people could share a car. They would pull down on University, pull off on the side, and then people will get out of the cars and each get into their own work trucks, park their original car, and then take their work trucks out. And I don't have a lot of data to quantify this, but I've heard from a number of residents who've taken photos or videos where they see this exact thing. And I think that this was an interesting finding from looking at the data when you look more holistically at the city. And there's another map here, if anyone's curious. So some of the solutions that I see for the city, um, the parking demand, as most parking reform network members know, there are various multimodal ways and residential parking permit programs to improve. I'm going to focus more on addressing the parking supply. One of the things that I also noticed when I was looking at the data that wasn't shown in this presentation was that a lot of the trash cans that are being left down the right of way are actually reducing like 10% of parking supply in some of the neighborhoods. For example, in the southeast portion of the city, which looked also like it had less parking demand, um, I estimate that there was like a 10% loss. And this was on a day that was 3 or 4 days after trash collection day. The city currently has an ordinance where you can't leave a trash can out about a day or a day after. It hasn't been getting enforced very much. And I think that enforcing this ordinance could actually make things a lot better for everyone in that neighborhood. People may be selfishly trying to reserve spots for themselves, or in many cases, people may be just trying to ensure other people don't park in front of their house, both of which, it's a public right of way. They can't control that. And it's actually hurting the whole neighborhood. And when I recorded this at 9 or 10 p.m., I doubt that many of these ended up getting filled, since it was already pretty close to the end of night. One other thing that I think should be done is more efficient enforcement of the 72-hour abandoned vehicle ordinance. This is addressing more on the parking supply side. There are a lot of abandoned vehicles, and the current process is very manual, where the burden is on the resident to call on a vehicle that seems to have been abandoned, which is typically already a few weeks that probably passed. And then the community service officer will come out, or police officer, to tag the vehicle, and then the clock starts, and they have to remember to come back. And it's just a lot of manual steps. And then lastly, I think some education as well on parking etiquette. For example, I've seen some evidence where like if some of this type of information is shared where when each person is putting out their own trash can, they may not see how it can harm like holistically. I think if this information was shared, it could help people feel like there's more of a collective good that they should be working towards. So in conclusion, East Palo Alto streets are about 84% occupied overnight. I think this underestimates the true number. Some neighborhoods have, at least for the past 8 years, consistently exceeded 100% occupancy, a lot of legally parked cars. Surprisingly, the highest parking saturation was in single-family home neighborhoods, not near the apartments. And um, there's also some evidence of non-residents uh, contributing towards the parking issue. And then I also shared ways that drones can be used to collect parking occupancy data. And I think it's a different way of collecting data, and I think it's something that could be scaled up in other cities. I wanted to acknowledge some individuals who had contributed towards this effort. My first parking reform network call was with David Hunt, who I actually just met with over the weekend, and he taught us how to use Google My Maps. I didn't know anything about the software before. Michelle Hunt from our city's transportation consulting company had shared methodology for computing the street parking capacity, and I was able to just compare to make sure what I was doing made sense. Our city's public works staff had helped a lot, and also our adjacent cities had shared some data and methodologies. And then I was also able to borrow the thermal drone. It's typically a $10,000 drone, and now it's like $5,000. It's definitely pretty expensive of a drone compared to the consumer grade ones. And yeah, I'll leave it at questions now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. It was really, really insightful presentation. And I also just wanted to congratulate you in taking the initiative to do this study, especially like in light of the fact that that the city itself had limited budgets. And I think that's really commendable. So, yeah, I'm just looking at the questions here in the chat. I think one question that's been coming up quite often here is relating to like exactly how you measured the occupancy. And for example, like if you could speak a bit to that, but also like for example, like when you I know there's some certain neighborhoods you had more than 100%, and so what would be like the kind of areas where you would most often see that over 100% occupancy? Like, is it on people's front lawns? Is it in alleys? Or yeah, exactly what's going on
Okay.
there?
Yeah, those are great questions. Let me take the first one first, which was it on how the parking occupancy was computed or just how it was measured?
Yeah, like how'd you define like the occupancy rate, for example, is one question.
Okay.
Like, was it just like the curb area in total?
Understood. Okay, yeah. So I'll use an example of a photo. Like if you look at this photo over here on the left, um, this would be the public street, and the cars that I was looking at were exclusively just cars in the public right of way. So for example, in this photo, I would have just looked at the cars over here, like in the street section, and then I wouldn't be counting these cars that are on private property. There were some cases where cars were straddling both public right-of-way and private property, and I compared this by looking cross-referencing our county's GIS maps for parcel boundaries. And if a car was more than 50% of the right-of-way, I counted it as a car in the right-of-way. And then also in this case, like this is an example where you see cars over double parked, just to starting to answer the other question about 100%. So here, people have actually parked two cars in the right-of-way. And so, because there are no other parking spots available, and that would be more than the number of cars that should be able to be parked on that street. Um, I don't have another good example, but if you imagine, there were some streets where are supposed to all park in the direction of travel, and then all the cars were like perpendicular, which I confirmed with the city is illegal, and police has been citing those instances. And then with regards to the second question about which streets had some of the worst, like over 100%. So now I'm going into this interactive map. And so I'll actually do a filter here where I can filter in Foursquare Studio on the percent full. You can ignore all colors now. The co colors were meant to differentiate, but once I filter, the colors stay. So if I look over 100%, these are the streets that were over 100%. You can again ignore the colors, although darker red is worse here than yellow, but they're all over 100%. Um, there are this side of the city is definitely very dense. it's almost all apartments. So as expected, this side did end up having like over 100% in many parts. This was like a street over here where cars were parking perpendicular to the direction of travel, so they were illegally creating more parking spots. And there were even cases where like there was what's that called? There were people parking into the right of way as well, and they would make them into like private parking spots. But when I looked at the county's parcel maps, the cars were all sticking out into the street by like half a car length. And then some of the other ones that are near 100%, I think the main finding about ones being closer to University Avenue, that was one observation you can see here. And I don't have many comments on some of these other streets, although one hypothesis I originally had about this part of the city, which is all single family homes, is that if you cross this Willow Road, it becomes an adjacent city, Menlo Park, which doesn't allow parking overnight on most of their streets, like citywide. And so an hypothesis before was, hey, are a lot of them actually coming over to East Palo Alto and parking? I didn't see that much evidence there, but I figured it could explain parts of this, why some streets here are more overparked. Does that answer the question?
I think that covers a lot of the questions around occupancy. And I guess I just wanted to say also that traditionally our lunch and learns end at 45 minutes, but since there was so much engagement today and all these questions, um, yeah, I think it's probably makes more sense to just extend another 15 minutes.
Okay.
And so yeah, people need to leave, yeah, please do so. But yeah, please stick around too if you want to answer a bit more questions. Yeah. I think, yeah, in terms of occupancy, we covered quite a bit, but I had a question that I was a bit curious. Uh, I think you could probably answer quite well. I'm really interested in understanding how well your study, for example, was received by the greater public or maybe other members of the East Palo Alto Planning Commission, and compare that maybe with like how it was received by council members, if you have any thoughts on that, and maybe why you think maybe there may be different receptions and maybe
Yeah.
like how, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think the first thing I'll mention is I had chosen to release this after council had discussed the parking permit program. There's a lot going on. It actually ended up getting delayed. But a lot of people showed up, over 100 people on both sides, but many of them strongly against the parking permit program. I did invite all council members and our supervisors. I think I see our vice mayor, Mark Dinan is here. I want to acknowledge him. And I see members of our Public Works and Transportation Commission, Isabel, and some others here as well. Um, the post got a lot of engagement for sure. The blog post, it's actually like one of our top three most read posts on our East Palo Alto Sun blog, and it's only been out for like a month now. And I didn't hear back from some of the other council members, but my hope has been that this can start shifting the narrative around parking permit programs and just how to solve this problem in general. My hope is that the data can give a more holistic picture and help quantify like how much pain people are feeling in different parts. Because some streets don't feel as much pain, and that may be their main experience of the city. And some streets feel a lot more pain, and some people even move out of the city because of that. Outside of that, I haven't heard too much else. Just in general, people have been impressed with the analysis, but I haven't seen a direct tie yet to any like actionable changes.
Okay. I mean, a question from Mark here. He says he's curious about how long the study took and what are the benefits of using drone technology to calculate occupancy versus more traditional techniques.
Sure, how long the study took and then the benefits. Yeah, let me reference this slide again. So, for me, it ended up being not too much time. So I flew the drone on about 8 or 10 nights, I think. And each night I was out for about an hour and 15 minutes. I've become very efficient at drone flying also since I had a drone photography company before and I've done a lot of flights. But the drone is able to capture data pretty quickly because if you kind of do a back to envelope math, it's like 38 miles of roads. It's more like 33 that we really cared about. And then the drone flies at 25 miles per hour. theoretically, if you had like the best path and never had to move, you could theoretically fly in like an hour and a half for the whole city. Of course, I had to kind of break up the city in quadrants and kind of position myself in one area to get a quarter of the city and then move myself to another area for the other portion just because of like signal. But I would say that it was less than 10 hours of drone flights. Let's just say a couple hours of setting up everything, driving over like 5 minutes to go fly. And then in terms of reviewing the footage, I didn't use any computer vision or AI. I did work on that in parallel, but because I wanted to make sure I was very confident in the numbers, I decided to just count it manually first. And I would say that was roughly a 1-to-1 ratio of drone flights to time processing. Maybe a little more than 1-to-1, because I was just watching the video, sometimes faster than real speed, and counting the number of cars and then putting it into the map. And then the analysis part where I did the maps took, we can call that like 10 or 15 hours, but it'd be a lot faster the next time around. And then in terms of some of the benefits of the drone, so I'll use some visuals here. I think it's not just about time, but it's also about like the quality of footage that's received. If you look at this footage, for example, or actually let me use that other footage. So if you look at like this footage, for example, with traditional means, if a car were driving down the street, like on the ground and using a camera or person to count, I'm not sure that they would have seen the second car behind this double park car. Just based on the angle, and you'd really have to be looking behind you when you pass the car. So I think it shows more details there. The other thing is that there were edge cases where the car, like I couldn't tell if it was in the public right of way or not. And using like this top-down view made it a lot easier to reference a map and just line up where the property line was to determine if the car was in the right of way or not. I think that if I was shooting from the ground, it would be harder to tell like if the car was on private property or not. And then some other benefits of the drones, I think that it was very useful to have like a clean drone video footage so that if anyone would ever dispute the numbers, like you have the video footage to back it up. Yes, if you're on the ground with a camera, you probably could also do that. But I think that on the ground, it becomes a little trickier to even determine what street you're on, since the angle and the features of the street may look kind of the same on many streets. It is kind of hard from the air as well, but if I got lost looking at the video footage, I oftentimes could line it up with the map and tell where the drone was at the time. So I think those are some of the things that made it a little easier during like processing afterwards.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious to know if you were inspired at all by another like similar drone study. Do you know of an example of like someone doing this by themselves and trying to advocate for like a parking reform in their city using drones?
I would say I was definitely inspired by some of our own parking reform networks. I saw some are in attendance today, like one of the ones for Parkalytics using the drones to analyze like parking lots, but not citywide, more like static areas. Um, I actually hadn't seen a drone study before for a like a large swath of area like a city. So yeah, I have to say I credit the transportation consultant for kind of seeding the idea in my mind. I had been showing her, I was trying to do some computer vision on the intersections that were bottlenecks, and they're like, "Oh, we already have this. Like, if you could do this other thing, like that would be really new to us, and you could do it faster and cheaper."
Okay. Um, yeah, Kara. Oh, there's someone asking a question from Germany here. Yeah, they're asking if there's any private parking available in the area that you surveyed, or is it mainly the on-street parking?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. There is not a lot of private parking besides just the ones for apartments, such as this one where they have their own off-street parking. As part of when the city last did a parking study in 2018, where they're all in agreement that parking was a problem, one of the recommendations was for the city to go talk to private property owners, such as our shopping center and our like churches. There's like 80 churches in the city, and they don't use the parking on most days. From my understanding, zero of those num of them were interested in like collaborating. I don't know the reasons, but I would imagine it's probably like liability, insurance costs, potential problems that it can cause. I know our current council is considering like ways of doing that, and our city also does not have any shared parking structures that I'm aware of right now. Like some other downtowns, like Palo Alto, will have like publicly financed like parking structures for that are shared amongst downtowns. We also don't have that.
Okay. I think, yeah, unless someone else has any other question, I think we've covered quite a bit here. And I do want to try to respect people's time. But yeah, if there's no other questions, maybe Chris, is there anything else you want to share before we call this off?
Um, no, I think I just want to thank Parking Reform Network and a lot of people who are involved in this project. Like, I think it's a community, and I like how transparent the information's been shared within the community. As I mentioned, this was built off of things I had learned from other presentations, and I hope that this inspires like a next thing that amazes all of us. And yeah, I think that's actually really powerful. And I was impressed that some of the transportation consultants who get paid to do this and other cities were willing to help too. That was really cool.
Well, yeah. Well, thanks so much, Chris. And yeah, really, again, commend you for the work you've done, and hopefully it inspires so many others to do their own study. If they feel like the city's not going to do it on an appropriate timeline, so that's it's really great initiative. Thank you.